Good. All right. Well, welcome to the Petaluma History Room's YouTube presentations. Tonight, our guest is John Patrick Sheehy. John and his wife live on Sonoma Mountain, not too far from where his great-grandfather settled in 1863. So, as a fourth-generation Petaluman, John grew up on the stories of those early days in a growing town. He and photographer Scott Hess wrote the book On a River Winding Home, Stories and Visions of the Petaluma River Watershed, which was awarded the Gay LeBaron Editors Award in 2019 from the Sonoma County Historical Association. I will now hand the show over to John, who will tell us more about the early history of settlers on Sonoma Mountain, a saga of lawyers, guns, and money. John, take it on.
Thanks, Connie. I'm going to begin this evening with the story of a feud that took place between two residents on Sonoma Mountain in the 1880s, named James Todd and Edward Puckett. Their ranches were at the top of Sonoma Mountain Road, just up from what we know today as Lafferty Ranch. And I've marked the three ranches of Puckett, Todd, and Lafferty with stars on the map here. Early one evening, after the sun had gone down, one of Todd's calves wandered onto the Puckett Ranch through a break in the fence. Todd came over to retrieve the calf, bringing along with him three of his teenage stepsons, the Cook boys, all of them carrying torches. They were met by Puckett and his 20-year-old son Alfred, a young literary prodigy known as the poet of Sonoma Mountain. After engaging in exchange of rough language, the two parties began to brawl. Todd's stepson, Willie Cook, pulled out a revolver and fired at Puckett, barely missing his head. Puckett's son, Alfred, attempted to wrestle the gun away from Willie, but was shot in the shoulder and the abdomen. Willie then pointed the gun at Old Man Puckett and pulled the trigger, but he had run out of ammunition. Charged with murder, Willie pleaded self-defense and was actually acquitted in a jury trial. Alfred Puckett eventually recovered from his wounds and went on to become a very distinguished local poet and historian. The two families continued to reside on the mountain in an uneasy standoff for more than another decade, which brings me to the focus of my talk this evening. Sonoma Mountain, a saga of lawyers, guns, and money. Now, of course, there was more to the fight between Todd and Puckett than a stray cow. The two men had been engaged in various feuds for 2 decades, which wasn't all that unusual on the mountain. For the past 200 years, since European contact, neighbors on Sonoma Mountain have battled each other in the courts over legal challenges to deeds, property boundaries, water rights, livestock, trespassing, and occasionally that has led to physical altercations, as we saw with Puckett and Todd. No feud has been as long-standing as the current one that's still being waged over public access to Lafferty Ranch, which has been owned by the city of Petaluma since 1959, when it was purchased as part of the city's waterworks. In 1992, the city announced plans to make Lafferty into a public park, kicking off a feud with neighbors that has encompassed a series of lawsuits over the past 3 decades now. But before we get into all that, I want to delve into some of the historical background about these feuds in the mountain. And while they appear to come with the territory, it certainly wasn't always like that. Prior to European contact, Sonoma Mountain was inhabited for millennia by the Coast Miwok. They called it Onopias. In their origin myth, it was an island in a primordial ocean at the beginning of time, a place where the world began. If you've been up on the mountaintop on the days when the valley below is fogged over, that image is not hard to envision. For tribal members, the mountain was a tended wilderness that they carefully nurtured and coexisted with. During hunting, fishing, and gathering seasons, especially for acorns, they dispersed from their main villages on the valley floor to small tribelets on the mountain near fresh water sources like springs and creeks. They kept the peace with neighboring tribes through trading agreements using clamshell beads, circular flat disc with holes drilled in them, as currency, and they rarely battled over resources. That changed with the arrival of the Spanish missionaries in 1817, who drove the natives off the land into mission labor encampments in San Rafael and Sonoma. In 1834, the Mexican government seized the mission lands, dividing them into land grants in vain hopes of enticing Mexicans to come and colonize Alta California. That marked a dramatic change in how land was viewed on the mountain, shifting from that of the indigenous natives who believed they were obligated to preserve the land for future generations to a new settler mentality of living off the land for one's only livelihood, a self-centered entitlement best summed up by the phrase, I have rights. That included introducing livestock and foreign crops that quickly transformed the landscape and its resources. General Mariano Vallejo, for example, maintained a herd of some 15,000 imported longhorn cattle, both on Sonoma Mountain and in the Petaluma Valley, which he raised for their hides and tallow, not for their meat. And those hides and tallow were then exported to Europe and New England from San Francisco for the making of leather goods, candles, and soap. In the mid 1840s, a number of unclaimed land grants were hastily awarded by the Mexican government to Mexican soldiers in anticipation of America's inevitable conquest of the West. In 1848, when Mexico conceded or ceded control of California to the Americans at the end of the Mexican-American War, they made sure to protect Mexican ownership of the land grants. They underestimated, however, the weaponization of the American legal system. In 1851, Congress passed the California Land Act, subjecting all Mexican land grants to legal review by an appointed land commission. Ostensibly, that was because many of the land grants were sketchy and in some cases fraudulent. The land itself was haphazardly surveyed, as you can see from this land map of the land grant that comprised Petaluma eventually, if surveyed at all. The burden of proving ownership in the act was placed on the Mexican grant holder, effectively putting the land grants into play. American land sharks and lawyers quickly descended upon the land-rich, cash-poor Mexicans, subjecting them to legal challenges before the courts, which forced many of them to sell off their land just to pay off their legal bills. Within a year, more than 40% of California's 813 land grants had fallen into the hands of American speculators who set about subdividing the land grants to sell to the arriving American settlers. The era of lawyers, guns, and money had begun. Now, on the screen is an ad for the real estate office of American speculator James Stewart, who in 1855 secured rights to the land grant that Petaluma sat on. Petaluma had been founded 3 years earlier in 1852 by George Keller. Now, he staked out an illegal claim to 158 acres of a Mexican land grant to lay out the town of Petaluma and begin selling off lots to land-hungry settlers, most of them very frustrated to arrive in California with aims of homesteading, only to find that the land was largely locked up in these Mexican land grants. Now, once the Land Commission approved Stewart's purchase of the land grant from a Mexican owner in 1855, Petaluma property owners who had acquired land from Keller originally were required to repurchase their lots from Stewart. The holder of the area's largest land grant, Mariano Vallejo, avoided getting caught up in these legal shenanigans. After Mexico ceded control of California to the Americans, he became an American citizen, and in 1850 was elected to the new California State Senate. That ensured there would be no legal challenges to his 66,000-acre Petaluma Rancho land grant, which extended from the Petaluma Creek east across Sonoma Mountain to the town of Sonoma. But Vallejo, too, found himself land rich and cash poor. During the Mexican-American War, his hide and tallow factory at the Petaluma Adobe had been trashed. His herd of longhorns had been stolen by rustlers once the gold rush began, who drove them up to gold country to sell to hungry miners who were willing to pay up to $500 a head, the equivalent of $20,000 in today's currency, for a single cow. Now, to generate cash, Vallejo began subdividing his Petaluma Rancho and selling the lots off, mostly to disappointed lost boys from the gold rush. Which brings us to Marshall Lafferty. In 1859, Lafferty purchased 270 acres on Sonoma Mountain from Vallejo. Born in North Carolina and raised in Kentucky, Lafferty had married at 17 and settled down in Illinois, where he and his wife Elizabeth raised 13 children. In 1850, he headed west for the gold rush, returning home 4 years later, largely empty-handed. In 1857, he returned to California via covered wagon with his wife and children, purchasing the ranch on Sonoma Mountain from Vallejo. By that time, the area was caught up in a series of monocrop boom and bust cycles. The cycle began in the early 1850s with the potato boom. Petaluma's first building, in fact, built in 1851, was a potato warehouse for shipping potatoes down to San Francisco. Now, that quickly faded by the mid-1850s due to overproduction and soil depletion, which became a common pattern in the 19th century. A cattle boom followed that boom with imported breeds from the East Coast, but fizzled out by the mid-1860s due to overbreeding and competition. In the mid-1850s, the Crimean War cut off wheat shipments to Australia and New Zealand from what is today Ukraine, and California, in response, came to the rescue, setting off a wheat boom across the state and in Sonoma County. The boom accelerated during the Civil War when Midwest farmers were prevented from shipping their wheat down the Mississippi River to Europe. California's wheat boom went bust in the 1880s due to soil erosion and Midwest competition. Now, many wheat farmers, like my great-grandfather, whose ranch was on the southern range of Sonoma Mountain near Lakeville, switched at that time to dairy ranching. The agricultural booms of the 19th century transformed the area. By the 1850s, livestock had chewed the native perennial fescue grasses down to their roots. Settlers replaced those grasses with annual grasses from the Mediterranean, which renewed well under excessive grazing. The new grasses changed the visual appearance of the area in summer and fall to light gold. In addition, by the 1870s, most of Sonoma Mountain had been denuded of its trees. This is a photo taken of the eastern slope of the mountain near Glen Ellen in 1910. You can see that the mountaintop itself is completely bare. If you drive over there today, it's densely covered with second growth trees. Now, my grandmother, who was born on the mountain in 1887, told me that there were no trees on the hills when she was growing up, just cows. And I thought perhaps they'd all been cut down to build those lovely Victorian homes in San Francisco. But no, after being cut down, the majority of trees were stacked into piles, burned under mounds of dirt, and lit on fire to slowly burn for 3 or 4 weeks until all that remained was charcoal. The charcoal was then shipped down the Petaluma River to San Francisco, where it was used to heat homes and fire steam-powered mills. It wasn't until 1869, when the Transcontinental Railroad opened access to east, that coal could economically be transported to California from the east. After that, What trees remained were milled for use as railroad ties or for firewood in the boilers of steam-generated locomotives when the railroad arrived in Sonoma County in 1870. So, given all these factors, how did Marshall Lafferty make a living on his ranch? Well, due to the ranch's steep terrain, running from 1,200 feet to over 1,900 feet in elevation, it's unlikely he was able to cash in on the wheat boom. It's more likely that, like many of his neighbors, he raised cattle and milk cows. But one advantage of the ranch's high elevation was that it was above the fog line, which, along with a year-round supply of water from Adobe Creek, whose headwaters reside on the ranch, made the property ideal for growing fruits and vegetables. We also know that Lafferty had an orchard of, it's estimated 250 apple trees and a vineyard of 700 grapevines, both of which were quite common among his neighbors at that elevation of the mountain. The grapes on the mountain in the 19th century that he produced were commonly used for the making of Tokay, Rosé, and Zinfandel wines. Marshall also grew Fuji persimmon trees imported from Japan, evidence of which remains on the ranch today. In 1867, on the eve of turning 60, Marshall Lafferty retired. He and his wife continued to live on the ranch, but sold the property to his two youngest sons, Isaac Newton Lafferty and Jeremiah Henry Clay Lafferty, or Jerry as he was locally known. The son Isaac became a school teacher in town and later Mendocino, leaving Jerry to manage the ranch. Jerry Lafferty married and had two children, and by all accounts, he was a very popular presence on the mountain, hosting lots of social dances where he played the violin and staging numerous hunting parties, along with his Irish neighbor, Patrick Lawler Jr. But he also had to contend with ongoing contentious disputes with neighbors around him. One persistent issue was over property lines. In the 1860s and 70s, ranchers constructed rock walls, many of them employing Chinese labor, to mark their property lines and to keep their cows from wandering astray. Barbed wire didn't arrive until the 1880s. Disputes naturally arose over where the property lines actually fell. In 1872, two of Lafferty's Irish neighbors, Jimmy O'Phelan and Nick Crilly, got into a legal dispute. Their ranches occupied parts of what is today the Fairfield Osborne Preserve, just beyond, and were located just beyond the border of Vallejo's Petaluma Rancho, which meant that they were open to homestead claims at the time. Now, a homestead claim required residency improvements to the land for 5 years before the homesteader could legally take ownership. The O'Phelan and Crilly dispute was over two overlapping claims on the mountain. Crilly staked his territory by erecting a rock wall along a large piece of land that O'Phelan claimed belonged to him. One evening, while Crilly and his wife Nellie were away in San Francisco, someone burned down their house on the mountain. Crilly believed it was O'Phelan. 6 months later, Nellie Crilly came upon O'Phelan and a hired man tearing down the rock wall her husband had erected along the disputed property line. With her handy shillelagh walking stick, she commenced beating up both men. Ashamed of being whipped by a woman, they did not press charges. 6 months later, Nick Crilly won his lawsuit and was able to claim much of O'Phelan's land as his own. Another contentious issue on the mountain was road access. In the fall of 1869, Sonoma County settlers experienced their first catastrophic fire when, thanks to the powerful northeastern Diablo winds, a small straw fire in Rincon Valley erupted into a firestone that came roaring over the mountain. and swept down to the city of Petaluma, which was only spared thanks to a change at the last minute in wind conditions. Now, after the fire, access off the mountain became an issue for landowners. All the roads at the time going up the mountain were one-way exits. Changing that was difficult as the roads at the very top of the mountain at the time were all private. The public portion of Sonoma Mountain Road, for example, extended from Adobe Road only to the entrance of what is today Lafferty's Ranch. After that, property owners had to cross over gated private roads to get to their ranches. In 1872, at the request of 50 mountain landowners, public road easements were secured on three private roads at the top of the mountain, all of which in turn connected to each other, providing alternative evacuation routes. The first extended up Sonoma Mountain from Lafferty Ranch to the top of the mountain, where it intersected on James Todd's property with a new public extension of Lehow Road, which ran up from today's Gatati, and that ran past Puckett's Ranch near what is today known as Gravity Hill. The intersection of the two roads, marked here by a star, also connected to a new public road that ran down the east side of the mountain into Sonoma Valley. The new public easements required landowners to line the roads with wooden fences for control of their livestock. But of course, there was a holdout. Edward Puckett. Puckett agreed to provide an easement across his property for the public road, but reserved the right to maintain two gates on the road to prevent his cows from wandering off the ranch. For years, his neighbors, including the Crillies and the Todds, complained about the nuisance the gates created on the public thoroughfare. Puckett offered to take them down on the condition that his neighbors build him a wooden fence along both sides of the road running through his property. The other contentious issue on the mountain was water rights. While winter storms drop an average of 23 inches of rain on the Petaluma Valley, the top of Sonoma Mountain captures an average of 50 inches, its crest literally scraping water from the clouds. And once a raindrop hits the mountain, it's either taken up by soil or rock and eventually spills out in a time-release fashion via artesian wells and springs. Those wells and springs fill the creeks that flow down the mountain into three different watersheds. Creeks on the west side of the mountain, most predominantly Dobie and Lynch Creek, flow into the Petaluma River shed, as seen here in green. Creeks on the northern side, most predominantly Copeland Creek, flow into the Laguna de Santa Rosa watershed, seen here in gray. And creeks to the east side of the mountain flow into the Sonoma Creek watershed, seen here in reddish brown. Now, in the 1850s and 60s, the city of Petaluma relied primarily upon wells in a couple nearby springs in town for using water carts to make deliveries to homes in the city's hilly areas. By the late 1860s, it became clear that city development was being hindered by water scarcity. That clashed with the expansive pioneering spirit of the times. Water became money, attracting a group of Petaluma capitalists, including John McNair, who created the Petaluma Water Company. Now, their plan was to divert water running down Sonoma Mountain from Adobe, Lynch, and Washington Creeks into town through flumes and iron pipes. They also planned to divert some of the water that flowed down the mountain from Copeland Creek away from the Laguna de Santa Rosa into Petaluma. To do so, they purchased some acreage through which Copeland Creek passed adjacent to Edward Puckett's ranch and constructed a crude dam to divert some of the creek's water nearly 4 miles through open flumes to Lynch Creek. Now, undercapitalized, the Petaluma Water Company struggled to get off the ground. In the early 1850s, three of Sonoma Mountain's largest and wealthiest landowners, William Hill, Tom Hopper, and Harry Hardin, formed the Sonoma County Water Company, eventually merging with the Petaluma Water Company. The company then secured rights to the springs that fed Copeland and Lynch Creeks, piping the water along with water from Adobe Creek into Petaluma. In 1888, the Laffertys sold their ranch to William Hill, the president of the Sonoma County Water Company, and they purchased the new ranch over in Glen Ellen, where Marshall Lafferty spent his final days, passing away at the age of 87 in 1892. His son Jerry passed away in 1914 at the age of 68. After purchasing Lafferty's ranch on the mountain, William Hill sent a crew out to open up more water flow from the two springs that were the headwaters of Adobe Creek. For income, he leased the ranch out for livestock grazing. Hill also purchased the adjacent 2,000-acre Lawler Ranch after Patrick Lawler died in 1887, and in 1895 built a reservoir on 12 of its acres that held 60 million gallons of water. By 1900, the two springs on Lafferty were generating 50,000 gallons of water daily. Adobe Creek itself, once it reached the valley floor, was generating a daily flow of 250,000 gallons, thanks to water from other tributaries as Adobe Creek came down the mountain. Altogether, the three creeks, Adobe, Copeland, and Lynch, were producing more than 350,000 gallons of water a day for the city. Now, in exchange for running their pipes across the mountain, the Sonoma County Water Company provided landowners with water rights and stock in the company. And yet, feuds over water still broke out between neighbors. In 1902, the water pipe running across Robert Forsyth's ranch developed a large leak that spilled onto the 2,000-acre ranch of Frank Roberts, one of the wealthiest men on the mountain. Roberts had the leak repaired and then sent Forsyth the bill for $57. Forsyth refused to pay it, after which Roberts sued him for the money, making it clear that the money itself was immaterial. It was the principle that mattered. Frustrated with the slow pace the case was taking in the courts, Roberts finally went over to Forsyth's house and attacked him with a cane. Forsyth successfully fought him off with a knife. Roberts then returned to Forsyth's ranch wielding an axe. This time, Forsyth fought him off with a club. Each man then filed charges against each other of assault and battery, both of which were eventually dropped, along with Roberts' suit for the $57. Lawyers, guns, and money indeed. So, given all this history, how did we come to the current legal standoff over Lafferty Ranch? Well, it all goes back to water. The privately owned Sonoma County Water Company changed hands a couple of times over the years, but continued to serve as Petaluma's main waterworks through the 1850s. By that time, Petaluma was drawing 50% of its water from Copeland, Lynch, and Adobe Creeks, and 50% from wells in the valley, largely on the east side of town. Now, that was sufficient for a population of 8,000 to 10,000 people, but not for the new local boom in suburban tract housing that was underway. For that, the city needed more water. In 1859, a voter-approved bond allowed the city to purchase the waterworks on Sonoma Mountain along with Lafferty Ranch. The bond also funded an underground aqueduct for transporting water from the newly dammed Lake Mendocino on the Russian River, facilitating the city's new suburban housing boom. In 1992, the city's waterworks on Sonoma Mountain were shut down after Lawler Reservoir was declared vulnerable to earthquakes. At the time, the city of Petaluma decided to convert Lafferty Ranch into a public park. That launched what has become the longest running legal feud in Sonoma Mountain history, as neighbors of Lafferty Ranch have engaged in numerous lawsuits against the city, including challenging public access to the ranch from the narrow spot where it intersects with Sonoma Mountain Road. That feud has now exceeded the 30-year feud waged between James Todd and Edward Puckett in the 1880s through 1900s, providing yet the latest chapter in Sonoma County's ongoing 200-year saga of lawyers, guns, and money. And with that, thank you all for listening. And I
Uh,
want to thank you, Connie, and the History Room as well for hosting this recorded session, and also to my good friend Scott Hess for the generous use of his beautiful photos of Sonoma Mountain.
oh my, John, thank you so much. There's so many goings on and shenanigans up there on the mountain. Thank you for so much for giving this presentation. And thank you to everyone who joined us this evening. If tonight's journey into Petaluma's colorful past has you curious for more, swing by the newly renovated Petaluma Regional Library and explore the Petaluma History Room, which is now downstairs. It's a treasure trove waiting to be discovered. You can find keep your eyes open for more presentations this coming year, both in person and online, hopefully with John. Uh, this so keep informed by checking out our website at sonomalibrary.org, including our blog called Not Just Chickens, Free Range History from the Petaluma History Room. Until next time, take care and good night. Thank you for coming.